In art history, the term Baroque is used to define the period from about 1600 to 1750 in Europe. Baroque comes from the term used to describe the irregular shape of pearls in Portuguese. Baroque, like many stylistic designations before and after, was originally a derogatory term. While it's not generally used in that manner today, it is still used to mean overwrought and ostentatious. Baroque today is seen as being largely successful in fusing the advanced techniques and grand scale of the Renaissance with the emotion, intensity, and drama of mannerism. Artists from all over Europe came to Rome to study the masterworks of classical antiquity and the High Renaissance. They returned home with new or old ideas, and this diverse group of artists put their new knowledge to use in expressing the concerns of their own cultures. There were many giants in the 17th century. In Italy, we had Bernini and Caravaggio, Bernini being a sculptor, Caravaggio a painter. In Spain, we had the great painter Velázquez. In Flanders, there's Rubens, also a painter. In Holland, we have three giants, Frans Hals, Rembrandt, and Johannes Vermeer, all painters. And then in France, we have Poussin and Claude Lorrain. Now, these artists were every bit the equal of their predecessors of the Renaissance, one by one a match in individual genius. Now, the styles of the Baroque are many. While it was an international phenomenon, its regional characteristics are very strong, perhaps even dominant. These characteristics have much to do with the social, political, and religious climates of each region. Such is the case with Italy, where the Catholic Counter-Reformation was served by magnificent new commissions of art. The three main figures of Italian Baroque are Bernini in sculpture, Caravaggio in painting, and Borromini in architecture. If not the first Baroque church itself, Il Gesù in Rome was certainly the place where the groundwork for Baroque architecture was laid. Two men were responsible for the work, Giacomo da Vignola, on whose plan the church was based, and Giacomo della Porta, who designed and built the facade that we see here. Each man's work was very important, as the plan represented a breakaway from the central plan church that was championed by Renaissance architects, and the facade also breaks with certain high Renaissance ideals of simplicity in its rich, ornate surface. When you step inside, you might make the observation that the facade bears little relation to the interior design. Now we go to St. Peter's in Rome. And the completion of St. Peter's had been evolving for what seemed like forever. While it's called the Great Baroque Building Project, St. Peter's is really at best a hodgepodge of styles that took over 150 years to build, perhaps not to the satisfaction of anyone involved, as many titans in art and architecture headed the project at one point or another. For the most part, Gian Lorenzo Bernini brought the project to completion with his design for a monumental piazza in front of St. Peter's. Now, Bernini was much more than just the greatest sculptor of the Baroque period. He was also an architect, painter, playwright, composer, and theater designer. Through all of his pursuits, Bernini left his mark on Rome as perhaps no other artist from this period. Much of Bernini's work fused sculpture, painting, and architecture in total environments that were designed to overwhelm the senses. This was the case in his baldacchino for St. Peter's, that stood over 100 feet tall. A baldacchino is a canopy on columns, and it's frequently built over an altar. The spiral columns here repeat the same shape in Old St. Peter's baldacchino, which is said to have come from Solomon's temple. In light of this, we can see the Baroque period as an extension, rather than a break from previous styles of art. Bernini's fusion of architecture and sculpture is rendered most forcefully in his Ecstasy of St. Teresa. As in other works by Bernini, he strengthens his work of collaborative media by carefully considering the impact, direction, and force of light on his work. The light flowing in spotlights the wide variety of materials, yet at the same time unifies the entire design. Bernini's work reveals not only his interest in, but total understanding of theater, for he no doubt saw his art as theater. Here he makes clouds of marble seem to float, and that infuses the work with an energy and passion rarely seen in sculpture. On a purely sculptural note, Bernini was still incomparable, as his David attests to this day. Muscle, flesh, and drapery are described equally well in this dynamic work, which helps define the Baroque. Rather than portray the moment before or after his violent action, Bernini presents David in the very midst of the action that he is so very determined to bring about. The Baroque period is a lot like this David, as it is a most active period between two eras, which we will ultimately discover to be fundamentally opposed. Bernini's dynamism in sculpture is echoed in the work of Borromini, the architectural giant of the age. Borromini animated his wall surfaces by combining never-before-linked shapes in a startling fashion. In this facade, he juxtaposes concave and convex surfaces, which make the walls seem to be in the midst of moving or rippling. In this respect, Borromini's elasticity in architecture may be even more impressive than Bernini's in sculpture, for we are at least familiar with the idea of figures moving. Borromini would have been happy to hear this assessment, as Bernini was not only his first employer, but also later became his arch rival. Now, further evidence of his obsessive genius can be seen in your textbook. Borromini was an emotional genius who died by his own hand, yet continued to inspire major artists of the future. One such inspired artist was Guarino Guarini, whose Palazzo Carignano clearly indicates Borromini's influence with the undulating quality of the wall surface, and this also features or contrasts concave and convex surfaces. While a great deal more conservative than Borromini, Guarini succeeds in making a simple architectural unit out of Borromini's turbulent cluster of ideas. Now we arrive at Italian Baroque painting. For once, as a group, the painters of the Italian Baroque don't seem as adventurous as their brethren in sculpture and architecture. It's almost as if the expression, "it's not cast in stone," became a rallying cry for the 3D artists of this time to disprove. The notable exception to this rule is Caravaggio, a painter of incredible visual and personal interest that we'll come to soon. I want to set the scene before we look at Caravaggio's work. In one sense, rather ironically, this was a time of great conservatism, as a number of artists sought to deny the focus of Mannerist artists. The brothers Antonio and Annibale Carracci founded the Bolognese Academy, which sought to teach art formally in the manner of the high Renaissance masters by studying nature, perspective, and other things of value to the artist. As seen here in their ceiling fresco, they broke little new ground, yet are very important for establishing the principal model for academies throughout Europe. One student of the Bolognese school was Il Guercino, and Il Guercino's illusionistic painting of the architecture into the ceiling and depicting forms at a 45-degree angle would serve as inspiration for artists to come in ceiling decoration. Yet once again, his manner of painting breaks little new ground. And here we come to the bad boy of painting. And we can throw all the reverence for the high Renaissance masters out the window as we come to Caravaggio. In fact, we can throw almost every rule, painting, moral, or otherwise, out the window with Caravaggio. As shocking as the image of the conversion of St. Paul is, it could not hold a candle to the shock of the painter in this case. Caravaggio may single-handedly be the man responsible for giving artists such wild reputations. I don't know whether to thank him or not for that. It's in keeping with Caravaggio's character to suggest that he was the first artist who sought to shock and offend with his work. His contemporaries called him an evil genius, and even the Antichrist of painting. He apparently fed on the horror, ugliness, and filthiness of sin. He was a bohemian and a rebel who fled to avoid prosecution for murder after stabbing a man in the groin over a tennis wager. Sounds like a really great guy. Now, as seen in this conversion of St. Paul, Caravaggio loathed tradition and sought fresh new solutions. His use of perspective, as seen in the wonderful horse's butt, draws us into the picture, while his use of chiaroscuro heightens the emotional impact as unimportant details disappear. Because of this reliance on lights and darks, his style was called il tenebroso, or the dark manner. The Musician seen here is one of Caravaggio's early works. Now, while it's not as dramatic as the conversion of St. Paul that was painted some 6 years later, The Musicians, or Bacchus, provides a clue as to where Caravaggio's interest will lie. There is tremendous chiaroscuro in the lower left corner of this painting. There's an almost crowded grouping of figures, and this will become much more dynamic and effective later on. What's missing in this painting? Extreme perspective. Also missing is a heightened sense of drama, and this may be inherent in a painting that seems to be sort of an exotic dream world. Nevertheless, the seeds for his success have been planted in this early painting. Another early work by Caravaggio is the still life, and this is a theme that we'll see become more common later on. It's rather unusual in that you have largely dark forms contrasted against a light background. In that sense, this painting is almost diametrically opposed to another Baroque master named Rembrandt. Around 1600, Caravaggio turned his interest from narrative genre paintings almost exclusively to the depiction of religious subjects. This is the Calling of St. Matthew, and as his subject matter became weightier, so too did his treatment of the images. This painting is rendered all the more dramatic by both light and compositional techniques. At once, two distinct groups are noticed: a horizontal block of figures at the table, and a vertical rectangular shape formed by the standing figures of Christ and St. Peter, who summon Levi, or St. Matthew, to another life and world. Light is used in this painting not just to describe form, but to advance the action. Three distinct light sources exist in this painting. There's the diffused light of the window, there's the dramatic cellar light coming from the upper right, and then, inexplicable, at least with respect to nature, is the illumination of Christ and St. Peter. You notice that they cast no shadows, so that instructs us to read the light there as miraculous. Now, how does Caravaggio tie this image together? As in the creation of Adam by Michelangelo, it is the hand of Christ which is the focal point for the image, both focusing our attention on the narrative and also bringing together the various compositional elements and disparate light sources. This Who Me painting is about 11 feet square, which no doubt makes for great impact in these life-size or larger figures. Here we have the Sacrifice of Isaac, and it's much more typical of Caravaggio's work in terms of larger figures filling the picture plane while engaged in a dynamic action. Now, Caravaggio, by the time he painted this, had come a long way in terms of how he modeled forms. As in the previous work, the figures are illuminated in a dark glade by a ray of, again, miraculous light. Here, Caravaggio fuses the spiritual with the natural, a concern we've seen growing in Italy for some 300 years now. Youth with a ram that we see here is thought to represent St. John the Baptist. Now, this work, as does the Death of the Virgin, shows both the good and bad sides, if you will, of Caravaggio. In Youth with a Ram, the shock lies in the openly erotic nature of the boy and his pose. Imagine the ram, old in this case as opposed to the pretty little lamb St. John is usually associated with, to be representative of a leering old man, and you get the point. Now, Caravaggio took great liberties with his subjects, yet his prowess is unquestioned. Like many works of art meant to be seen in a particular place, Caravaggio deliberately distorted his image here. This image from the Nelson Atkins Museum in Kansas City is one that shows that distortion. And the triumph of Caravaggio lies in his distortion for the light situation intended for the painting itself. It seems overly dramatic here, but if you were to go into the museum and dim the lights, the figure itself would appear to become alive and jump off the wall. These things were meant to be seen in rather dark churches. We put spotlights on them, and in some cases it kills the paintings. This is Caravaggio's Death of the Virgin, and the shock in the Death of the Virgin was twofold. First, he used a drowned young woman for his model of Mary. And secondly, he left her feet uncovered. That was a rather indecent thing in Caravaggio's day. This is the Entombment, and as sweet as Caravaggio's early style could be, so too could his late style be overly dramatic. Yet in this case it is tragic. This was the sole painting of Caravaggio's maturity that gained unanimous critical acclaim. In fact, this painting has been much copied, No less than 44 drawn, painted, and engraved copies are known to exist, with even one watercolor study executed by Cézanne. The group of figures in the painting are just that, one group, compact and monumental, almost like a piece of sculpture. While the figures are not in motion, the painting is far from static, as their diagonal movement to the left shows where their path will be. With respect to iconography, the stone to be used as the tomb cover refers to Christ as the church's foundation. The point of this stone, along with the outward glance of Nicodemus, engage the viewer, making this work all the more powerful. Now, Caravaggio was certainly not a very nice man, and it's ironic that many of his greatest works dealt with religious themes. No doubt this irony was not lost on him, as his late painting of David attests. David is seen here in relation to Christ. He's compassionate, but he dispenses justice firmly. The horrible aspect of this image is the head of Goliath brought forward by the pictorial cliché of the foreshortened left arm. No doubt Goliath here represents the damned in a larger sense, and it's most telling that Goliath is a self-portrait by Caravaggio. Now, the head cannot merely refer to Caravaggio's criminal escapades and irreverent sexuality, but seems to indicate that he saw not only his body as diseased, but also his soul. As Caravaggio relied on nature for his images, he no doubt was a realistic man, foretelling his own ironic fate. Now, Caravaggio did indeed live on, not literally, but in his influence on artists to come. One major figure certainly familiar with this particular painting was Rembrandt, who no doubt used this work as the basis for his Lucretia. One immediate follower of Caravaggio was Artemisia Gentileschi, perhaps the first female painter of some importance that we've seen this semester. Clearly derived from Caravaggio's methods, there's a great deal more to this image than meets the eye. This painting is Judith with the head of Holofernes, or Judith and her maidservant with the head of Holofernes. Gentileschi was raped by a fellow pupil when she was a 19-year-old art student, and she was then subjected to a humiliating trial in which she was tortured with thumbscrews to get her to recant her story. This episode played a major role in her art, for after her attacker was acquitted, she devoted herself to painting women who wreak violence against the men who wronged them. Now, she painted this theme of Judith and Holofernes 5 times, and in this painting Judith is an explicit self-portrait. Now, while her use of perspective as an organizational tool is not as effective as Caravaggio, she is still a very strong painter. On the downside, look at the candle-to-hand relationship in this painting and the lack of drama as compared to Caravaggio's David. You see that the candle is sitting on a table that is roughly parallel to her figure, her torso, yet she reaches her hand toward us, seemingly past the candle, yet that hand's illuminated by the candle and is casting a shadow back on her. It's very odd spatially. Now, Gentileschi's painting of Danae is in the St. Louis Art Museum, and she was taught to paint by her father Orazio Gentileschi, and her story has been featured in several recent historical novels. Now, Domenichino is another artist whose work follows Caravaggio, and while elements of Caravaggio's work are more readily seen in others by him, Domenichino influenced painting in terms of the handling of landscapes, as did his teacher, Carracci. Poussin and Claude Lorrain in France will take this ideal landscape, done by Italian masters, to new heights in the middle of the century. And this concludes our look at the Baroque in Italy.